Welcome to All Things Africa, the podcast. Listen in as Levy, Mike, and Linda discuss socio-political and economic current events and how they affect Africans worldwide.
Okay, welcome to our podcast. Thank you for staying with us. And today we are talking about education and technology in Africa. Africa today faces a time when the education situation or context is shifting with new technologies coming in. We have seen MOOCs also coming in to Africa. We've seen new softwares, we've seen new platforms for learning. And the context of coronavirus has actually made this question more urgent, with more schools being shut down and with uncertainty on whether schools will open. And because everybody wants to continue learning, the question has been, how can learning continue in such contexts? But it's not a question of the pandemic as a context, but it's also a question of a transition point or an inflection point in terms of how does it become the future as well, in terms of transitioning to a time when we have adaptive education models and systems where technology plays a part, but we also get to know how to use them. There have been many challenges in this context of coronavirus, whereby although the technology is present, the way to use the technologies have been difficult. The ways to actually use them to facilitate learning has been difficult. There are cases where children find them to be distracting more than productive. There are also cases where parents are not familiar with some of these platforms and how to use them. Not just a parent problem also, but also a teacher's problem. Some of these technologies become so new and introduced abruptly to the point that they are not being used well in terms of facilitating learning. And so today we want to talk about all those issues and try to grapple with them. We may not have answers for all of them, and we don't promise answers for all of them, but just to identify ways in which technology can be useful for education and can be useful for learning, not just for teaching, but for the fact that students are supposed to learn using them and not be distracted by them. There are some constraints that different contexts face in terms of electricity, in terms of bandwidth, in terms of speed, in terms of internet speed, and what you can actually do with them. So all these limitations make this an attractive issue of using technology in Africa, but also raise the question of how can it be done effectively and what needs to be done to make it effective in today's context. How can we take advantage of opportunities that are present today in the context of Africa in terms of technology, where we've seen a growth of software engineers, we've seen a growth of technology companies, we've even seen hubs emerging in different contexts that can actually do this. The question though is, technology is one part. The other part is, how do you use it effectively to achieve the goals you want to achieve in the education sector? So just to set that off as a big question, Linda and Mike, what are your preliminary thoughts on this link or relationship between technology and education? What have you seen in terms of the constraints, the challenges and opportunities, or any of those that we face currently in Africa?
Well, I think mainly, for me, I think the challenges are mostly, at the moment, mostly driven by infrastructure, hardware problems, and policy. So, for example, if you take a case of Kenya, there was a time when the government wanted to roll out a program where every child would have a laptop that was starting off in, I believe that was the first, right after kindergarten. And but the process of implementation was bogged down and sort of challenged by secondary factors like, okay, if you have the child with a laptop and a teacher who hasn't been trained to leverage the laptop as an education tool, then what is the value add of the laptop? And then the other secondary factors related to that, as far as safety, as far as tracking, the laptops themselves, made it a little difficult to actually follow through. So there was a policy, there were other things that were not in place policy-wise, whether it's in terms of how teachers were being trained and what the policies were around that. Or even, okay, if you have children with laptops, what tools are they going to be using on the laptop that match with what is being taught in class? So that those had to be developed. How do you incentivize, whether it's the public or private sector, to develop those tools that can be used in the classroom? Again, back to a policy thing. So I think it was a mixture. And then this COVID thing, you know, as we all know, and those challenges were global. Yeah, most children were forced to learn from home, but then the idea of, well, how many of them have laptops at home and then have stable internet connections at home? Not just the students, also the teachers, because, you know, they've been in certain spaces, there have been reports of teacher absenteeism being also high because they have their challenges also in their households. So I think it's just a conundrum of policy challenges and then the actual hardware challenges on the physical laptops, but then the internet connection. And that's all of those things are not things that only the private sector, only the public sector can solve. But the public sector is responsible for creating the type of environment that even the private sector can inject solutions in that space. So if the policy formulation doesn't match the environment that the business solutions can come up with, then, you know, there's a heavier burden on the government to try and solve some of these things, which with other pressures might be elusive, if not, you know, impractical in the short term.
Yeah, I'm trying to look at it from, I know both of you are, you know, teaching online as faculty. And for me, I'm a instructional designer on this side. So I work with faculty to create online courses. But when I think about e-learning and the situation, as far as like, at least the primary education, even higher education too, when you look at Africa, I think a couple of things that were a struggle here within the US for even faculty to implement was a lot of them were just not very technologically savvy. And a lot of them are very late adapters when it comes to technology. So a lot of them had to be forced into learning how to use Zoom to quickly move their classrooms online. I know even the classroom teachers at our local elementary school, they weren't used to using computers. They didn't know how to set up a classroom online. So they had to quickly learn, you know, for a lot of them, Google Classroom. Some people learned Canvas. Some people did different, you know, different mixture of things, whether it's Zoom plus an online classroom, or some people just printed out materials and parents had to pick it up weekly and work with their kids. But it made me really aware that most people are just not, most of the faculty, leave alone parents and students, most of the faculty weren't prepared for this. And so, you know, it's like several approaches that have to be done as the faculty development side of things, along with technology, teaching them how to use that technology, teaching them how to leverage it properly and create a classroom environment online, using that technology appropriately too, because it's not appropriate to spend 6 hours on Zoom teaching a lesson. There's a certain level of fatigue of looking at everybody on the screen and trying to keep up with the material that it's just not a good design for the class. You know, an instructional designer will tell you, don't just move an in-person course onto Zoom. That's not automatically an online course, you know. So a lot of people think, oh, I just move it all to Zoom and you email me your assignment. That's not online learning. This is an adapted format just for the time being. But if we're going to move forward and create good quality online courses moving forward, there has to be, you know, there's a standard for it. And so that standard will make the difference when it comes to the experience of the student and the proper outcomes that we want to for them to have out of that course. When I'm thinking about Africa, I first go right into infrastructure, right? Levy, you talked about, electricity access. You talk about, leave alone needing to have internet access, but something I always believe when it comes to Africa, because on some fronts, infrastructure wise, we are behind on some things, but that might be looked at as negatively, but I think of it as a positive opportunity to grow from the lessons learned from the other places, right? We don't need to start from a grid system. We can move away from the grid system. We can go right into, new power structures. We can have solar power. We can have wind power. We can set up all of those instead. That requires a lot less investment, when it comes to creating a grid system like we did previously. In this situation, when it comes to internet access, our phone broadband strength is much further than it used to be. It used to be that you could only call, right? So our phones are a better technology. So now smartphones are basically mini computers. And I will say that many of my African family members have better phones than I do. I go over there and they have the newest, latest iPhone, the newest, latest Samsung, and I'm over here my screen's broken on my iPhone 6. And so, but because of that technology, I think we want to jump right into, we need computers, we need all this stuff. But because of that technology, it might make it easier for us to move learning online without needing to, create this huge structure. If the bandwidth from your cellular company, or they can sell better airtime for learning opportunities, you work with them instead of trying to come up with an internet company provider, which is very expensive on the ground, especially if you don't have the infrastructure for it. But you definitely have phone service. So if you leverage that and build courses through platforms that are very mobile friendly, then you can extend the learning to those cell phones instead. They still have textbooks of things like that. So they can, but on their phone, there's an app, Canvas has an app, Google Classroom has an app, all the different platforms, they have apps that you can build your classroom, your activities, and then relate it with, materials like the book or whatever the things that they need to do. You can write on Google Docs from your phone. You can type up a whole essay. It's not ideal, but it's possible. And so looking at that, I think, there's opportunities to create online learning if we use existing resources without needing to spend billions and billions of dollars in each country. Use the cell phones. Some teachers have been great about using WhatsApp. Because WhatsApp, you can share files, you can do audio clips, you can do all kinds of things just on the free version. So you learn how to use that and you can still continue learning. I think learning needs to be taken out of the box of it can only occur at school. And so online learning has broken those barriers of needing to be physically in a classroom, and so I think we should take full advantage of that where we can.
I want to build some of points that both you and Mike are mentioning. I like that point Mike pointed about policy gaps in terms of, because this is a new situation, there is probably the gap that there were no policies for some of these things. And standards, I think, Linda, you also talked about standards, the idea that there needs to be some standards. And I think some of these standards could be described in policies that adapt to the current situation, to elaborate and specify how learning should occur. One of the things that both you and Mike point out with regards to using tech appropriately to facilitate learning, even on your last point, Linda, is that issue of, that question of what is learning, right? What is learning in both in a brick and mortar context, and what does learning look like in a tech context? And I think the key aspect of learning, I think the three parts of learning that we could even engage with is the idea that, with learning, you encode learning, you acquire the knowledge, you store it, and you retrieve it. I heard this other point that was made this morning of the idea of a bank deposit, right? Where you could see tech can be like a bank deposit metaphor where you could actually use tech. Kids can use tech, but they're just acquiring information, and the information stays. The issue becomes the challenge of, do they store it in the right way? Do they retrieve it in the right way? These three very simplified processes: encoding, storage, and retrieval, and how that occurs. Because in the context of tech, then you are hoping that the parents can carry on and help with that other part of the process of retrieving learning so that it stays. And maybe some standards can be described in terms of how those three key simple stages of learning can occur, so that learning is not just about providing that information on a platform, but the process itself of making that learning actually stick. I was watching an NPR news yesterday. There was a short sort of section where they were interviewing parents in the US on the challenges they have faced with kids using tech. And there were about 10 or so parents or less, but more, I think the parents were highlighting the fact that they don't think kids are learning from the apps. They don't think kids are actually acquiring this knowledge from the apps. They are nice, they're appealing, you watch the videos. I tried one actually with my son who's 5-year-old, and I was watching him just to see how he's engaging with it, to experiment as a teacher. Like, what is he going to do with this app? It's a Kenyan app, actually. I wanted to see what he would do with the Kenyan app and how he'd engage with it. And for him, there was learning occurring subliminally, but it was the fun of clicking things. Like, he would keep repeating this, clicking this and clicking that and clicking that, and then I would ask, so what did you learn from that? He was like, and then I would sense he's learned, but he doesn't know how to articulate what he has learned, because in that particular engagement, there was no teacher to sort of help him to figure out what he was learning from that particular app. But he kind of has a sense that he learned something from it. And me as a parent sitting with him there, and also being a teacher sitting with him there, I know the learning goal because I've seen what the learning goal was. And I can tell that if he had learned from the app, he should be able to sort of say what the goal was. But he didn't, right? Because it was an app, he was just playing with it. And if there was someone in the house who sort of helps him in that process of storage and retrieval, he would be able to retrieve what he learned from there. And that's where the parents come in, right? In the sense that because you've removed the teacher, you sort of assumed the child can learn at home by themselves, and then they can't, because like we're saying, the training doesn't only belong to the parent, to teachers. Training is for parents too. Like, the issue should not be that the training stops at the teachers. The issue is, how do you also train the parents to sort of jump in and take it over from there, so that the app is not just an entertainment piece. There's a learning taking place, and I could tell, but I just knew he was struggling to figure out what the learning was supposed to be in that particular 5-minute video. And it worried me then that in some cases, maybe that's the challenge we face in a transition where the training is not sufficient, where maybe the teachers and parents are not talking enough in terms of, this is what the child is supposed to learn from this app. You could envision a situation where even teachers and the parents meet first online, maybe through a WhatsApp group meeting, before the students engage with it, so that the students are supposed to know what this learning was supposed to be. Otherwise, it becomes a series of 1 hour of clips where they play with them, but then they can't figure out what they were supposed to learn. But it is interesting. I think my point is that the training should go beyond teachers, and maybe we need to see more collaborative relationship between parents and teachers, because by extension, the parents will have to come in, even if you think about the challenges in terms of time. Because for me as a parent, I was thinking, I was sort of doing an experiment in terms of what would be my role here. And I realized that my role there would have been to introduce to him what the goal is here for this app he's about to play with. And then later was to come and say, did you learn this in this particular app? Because he was struggling to figure that out. Yeah, Mike, I see you want to jump in here.
No. It's interesting conversation. So how long was he on it? Like, was it a guided? Was it a lesson?
It's not guided.
Okay.
So you go to this Kenyan education. I think Kenya Institute of Education has these apps, and I forget the actual name, sorry, but you go in and you find a series of apps for different lessons. And there was an app where I think you were supposed to learn about, was it colors or something like that? It's a while ago. And so he clicks on the app, and then he sits and watches that 5-minute section about the app. And there's someone there's a teacher in that particular app. There's a voice of a teacher guiding him in terms of what he's supposed to do and asking him some questions. So yes, he was listening to what the teacher was saying and trying to understand what the teacher was saying, but at the same time, the app was the particular scenario was interesting to him. It was a little boy who opens a door, who goes in here, so there was an entertainment aspect to it as well. So I found that he was very interested in that entertainment part of this kid who is walking into the room and opening this box and doing this. And so there was this layered challenge he was facing where he wants to be entertained by what's going on. And I don't know whether he was really interested in what the teacher was saying more than this scenario where the kid, because sometimes even in teaching online, we say that teaching online has things that are distractions. And Linda, you do e-learning, so you know that you have to limit the distractions. And sometimes those distractions get the best of learners. And I figured they were getting the best of him, that he was missing. And he's a kid.
He's a kid.
Exactly. And he's enjoying these things.
Yeah. And that's, and it gets me to thinking about some of the comments that I've heard from parents and just adults. There's some adults who have looked at this online learning and from their perspective as adults working in a certain profession who have gone through an education system, they don't believe that they would have been able to acquire the knowledge they acquired in a traditional setting, an online setting, because they just think that online is quote unquote not for them. Yeah. So there seems to be this dichotomy for what kind of student would be able to thrive online and what kind of student might not be able to thrive online. And I guess from an instructional designer's perspective, is there a way to identify that, or in terms of the content, or do you identify that in terms of the individual student? And then how do you go about doing that? Because if that is the case, if there are some people who might not be able to get as much from an online setting, then in those early years, those formative years of education, wouldn't it make sense to be able to identify those kids?
Yes. You know, as an instructional designer, you have to know the learner very well. And, you know, we have two different learners that we're kind of talking about. You got child learners, which is one set of needs, and an adult learner. You know, those early formative years, you need a little bit of the hand holding. You need a teacher. You really need an instructor to guide them along the teaching, you know, whatever it is that they need to learn. Make sure you're reinforcing it, you know, creating the proper dialogue. It's almost like those formative years, the teacher's really teaching you how to learn. And then as you're older, you learn, you know, you have the skills to be able to go and learn yourself, you know, and you're able to be more of a self-directed learner versus a teacher needing to teach you how to learn. And so when I think about the younger years, especially elementary age, you know, under 10 years old, they do need the structure of a classroom. They need that constant authority figure when it comes to learning, and also for them to bounce back and go, am I really getting this? Am I not? You know, and so that teacher is really there to be that sounding board and go, yes, that's correct. Yeah, you thought of it this way. That's good. You're thinking of it this way and that way. And so they need that constant feedback. When kids have been home this period of time, they might have a packet, they might be on video, but if they don't have somebody constantly providing that feedback to them of whether they're getting something and not getting it, or what it is that they're learning, it's harder for that kid to really know what they're learning. They might enjoy it to an extent, but they might not quite get what I was learning, these like videos that are more educational, where there's an instruction going on, but then there's also somebody that provides feedback, like, what is this? Oh, this is that. Yeah, you're right. Giving them the opportunity to provide them feedback is important. But if we throw young learners who haven't had that consistent feedback or learn how to learn, and you throw them into a situation without proper support, they're not going to quite get it. Now, when we're adults and we go to school, we see this especially, and I use the word adult loosely, but really I'm thinking of more like graduate school, right? Because when we're undergrad, we're still pretty much kids. We didn't quite get the concepts. We didn't understand how to formulate arguments and dissect information. But by the time we go to graduate school, we've learned how to look at information and strategically break it apart and try to learn more. So then, more of our teachers in graduate schools, they kind of assign us reading versus doing a lecture, because they only come back and do a lecture to reinforce certain information that you should have learned. But most of it is very explorative. They send you down a path and they want you to come back and report back what you're learning. That's the adult way, because as adults, we're finally at the point where we're actually interested in learning. We're actually wanting to dig into more information on things that we're interested in. The early years, you need a whole lot of stuff. If it was up to us, what we choose to learn, many of us would know absolutely nothing about math, or many of us would know absolutely nothing about history, or nothing about language development or grammar, if we had the choice. But in your adult years, you have that foundation that really helps you to synthesize or break apart, what you're learning. And so you have to, as a designer, as an instructor, the formative years, you're a teacher. The adult years, when they're in higher education, you're more of a facilitator of learning, not so much a teacher.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that Linda is talking about, Mike, that I wanted to capture there is that there was this assumption, right? There was some assumption sort of that the tech would replace the teacher. And I think we quickly realized that it doesn't smoothen that way. And I think a lot of parents, even in the US, later came and said, "We love you, teachers. We can't do this. You do a lot of work." Because then the work that teachers actually do became very evident, that metacognition is not a strength that kids have, not even teenagers. Even teenagers don't have. And that's why we give teenagers feedback. In college, because if you think about feedback, the 3 steps of feedback is basically, you set a target, you say this is your target, you say this is where you are with regards to your target, and this is how much you need to get to your target. And so even for my son, to him to enjoy the app and to learn from it, I would have to actually break down those for him, and in that 1 hour or so sit down with him and figure out where he was on that learning outcome and learning goal. And so for a teacher in a classroom, that's the job they do. Certainly, Mike, you could say you could code some kind of metacognitive activities in an app, or feedback activities in an app. Maybe that could be the replacement for getting a kid to learn by themselves. But then, there are some cognitive limitations that kids have in terms of how much they can focus on something for so long without becoming bored with it, and how long they can sit down. Even for my son, usually on average, 15 minutes is enough for him. And so you have these overload issues where you have a kid is overloaded and it's 30 minutes and you realize they're not learning anything beyond 30 minutes. Even for us, you think about seminars, usually you set them at 1.5 hours, 90 minutes max, because there's a threshold. And sometimes the dump in the app approach can dump too much in an app because you haven't structured it in the right way. So Mike, you're raising a good question in terms of, and Linda is talking about the right things, metacognition and feedback. How do you sort of replace those in the context of an app for kids? For me as a parent, even Linda, you as a parent, we know how to use tech and we know what learning is. So our kids, to Mike's question, have an advantage of getting ahead in an app. And they are the kids who will move way ahead of other kids because I know how to take an app and know how to make use out of it for my kid. Another parent may just say, oh, here's an app, I have other things to do. And they go do things. And by the end of the day, the kid didn't get much. So Mike, even to your question, what kind of kid, it's an issue of what kind of family, what kind of parents, what kind of support, what kind of other people are around them that can make sure that tech, it's not just tech, but tech actually can achieve its goal. Even in advanced universities, nowadays you find that, even in our universities, you find that tech is supplemented by some mentoring and some coaching on the side to make sure that there's feedback and metacognition and guidance to make sure that it does not necessarily replace the human interaction. Anyway, Mike, go ahead.
No, I was saying on those 3 steps. So you have the target, you have where you are, and then you have what you need to do to get to. So let's sort of frame it as the target is set by the curriculum. Yeah,
the learning outcome or the learning goal.
Yeah, which is kind of beyond the teacher, right? That's a bigger national education question at each grade or each whatever. And then you have the assessment of where the child is, which could be facilitated through technology or maybe through a teacher. And then the gap, how do you fill a gap between where they are and then the target? So in terms of that sequence and the balance between technology and then the teacher's role in facilitating technology, in the formative years, are we saying that it is more important to sort of have the guide to help the child fill the gap between where they are and the target, and then later on, that role is kind of switched, becomes more of the responsibility of the student. Let's say if we go all the way to grad school, to then they're assessed to be informed where they are, but then more of the heavy lifting in terms of getting them from where they are to the target becomes more of their thing. Using technology or using whatever means they prefer, but it becomes more of their responsibility. But in the earlier years, maybe the emphasis of the technology is really assessing where the student is, but then the rest is picked up by the teacher. Is that about fair to say?
I think you could say fairly that I like that distinction between formative and later years. But the assumption here, based on what Linda said, is that they have learned how to learn, right? You could still get in your further years and you've not learned how to learn,
That's true.
right? In the sense that you're really subject to your biases in your assessments, and this is one of the challenges that we see in learning.
We have met some of those people. And
It's about overconfidence bias, right?
There's an institution called Extra Credit that was created for them. Anyway.
Yeah, a simple bias like overconfidence bias or confirmation bias is enough to make assessments useless, right? So you could have an assessment that I've even seen situations where a student challenges the technologies that assess them and says, no way, this thing is wrong.
Something wrong, absolutely.
I got this rubric is messed up. I got this one, forget this. I'm not using it again. Then they disengage from it. So even in learning how to learn, there is a boldness, intellectual boldness that comes with it, in the sense that you have to be intellectually bold and be willing to fail, right? So that there is still some other elements at a different level, right, Mike? In the sense that you could see you've seen college kids who you'd assume they know how to learn. They really don't know how to learn. And
that's what I'm saying, man. It's the institution called Extra Credit.
So they could go through a whole year of using an app.
There's a bank called Extra Credit that they can go make a withdrawal from, man. You better have something in there every class for them to withdraw from. Anyway.
I think for little kids, it's just, the executive function is not very strong. From a neurological standpoint, the executive function of controlling themselves is not strong enough, to the point that sometimes the teachers in preschool and kindergarten play this role for them, even in houses. Sometimes the parent has to play that executive function role and teach how to focus, how to concentrate, how to sit, how not to be distracted by the app, how to focus on what the app really wants you to do. I've seen an app where my son, he realized that if he clicks on the arm, it will do something different. And if he clicks on the feet, it will do something different. If he clicks on the mouth, the person will shout. And so he just clicks on the mouth for so long, so the person keeps shouting, whoa, whoa, whoa. And I'm like,
that's the same thing I'll do. Same thing, even now.
I think you both hit on the point that when it comes to online learning, people focus too much on the technology and the tool. When technology should only be a tool. It should only be the last thing that you look at when it comes to creating instruction. So when you're creating the instruction, you got to focus on your goals, right? Your learning goals, your activities, how you will deliver that knowledge, and then how you will assess that knowledge, all that stuff. And then you bring in the tool and go, okay, which tool aligns best with what I'm trying to do, what are the instruction that I'm trying to give or the assessments that I'm trying to give. The tool should be the last thing, but oftentimes we jump straight to, oh, it's an app, it must be good, and it's like, no, not if you haven't already introduced the concept or what needs to be learned. When I see teachers using technology effectively, it's usually way after they've taught the student something. So if I'm teaching math and I'm teaching them about addition and subtraction, I do that for several weeks. And then the tool of the computer or an app for them to use becomes something that they use as part of the practice of what they've already learned, versus using that app or that technology immediately at the beginning of that instruction. Then you lose the process of teaching them what this thing is about first. And then so when they go to the app, they understand what they're doing. They're focused on what they're doing. They're not distracted by the other things. There could be a character on there. Instead of them paying attention to the character, they know they are here to do the addition and subtraction, and they focus on that part. So it's important that instructors, period, or say administrators who are like, oh, let's buy all this stuff. Don't buy anything. Don't go right into the technology. Build your curriculum and then decide what is the best technology to deliver that with, and it might not be what you initially thought was going to be best, because you decide after the fact, after designing and writing out your plan.
So if we think about sort of the space that teachers, students back home were forced into, mm-hmm. There was no time to, or maybe there was no time, strategy, maybe, or maybe they just didn't have the training to really take the online version, the in-person version of teaching to the effective online format. Yeah. So and because of that, there's been disharmony, yeah? So in terms of learning outcomes. Yeah. So parents have had to take up some of that, some of the responsibility, I guess, of trying to facilitate learning, mm-hmm. which they're struggling with. So from your perspective, in terms of a student in a house trying to interact with educational material that isn't best formatted for that type of interaction, and a parent dealing with trying to help facilitate learning, what do you tell them? Because schools are not going to, it's going to be a while before they really do it, to take it up the way they're supposed to. So what would you tell a parent who is struggling with that part of from an instruction?
Yeah. I think, as an instructional designer and as a parent.
As a parent, yeah, exactly.
Had to go through this. I think it's important for us to remember that long time ago, before schools were around, it fell on the family to educate their own children, and oftentimes those families, they still had to come up with ways to provide for their family, financially, physically, whatever else, right? A woman, even if she wasn't working, she was working all day long, cooking, preparing the home, keeping everything. And, you have to flexibly go, all right, so 8 to 5 o'clock school schedule is just not going to be possible here. So you have to switch it. You have to decide, okay, And the homeschool parents do this often, where they'll do school either at night or on the weekends. And with the younger children, they don't spend all 8 hours at school or 6 hours at school completely learning. They probably spend no more than 2 to 3 hours engrossed learning. The rest of the stuff is extracurricular, is social, it's all of that. So don't stress yourself about needing to spend 6 hours working on math, science, history, all these things. Focus on 1 to 2 hours of good quality instruction, right? So you sit with your child, say when you get home in the evening. If one parent is better at math, let them do the math. One person's better at this, divide it up and work with that kid. And I think focus on where they're not so strong. Instead of trying to teach them something that they might already know, kids will tell you, I already know that. We went over that last week, blah, blah, blah. So then just focus on what they're weak in, right? Go straight to the assessment, let them do the assessment. You're able to see, oh, you missed all of this. Let's work on that. Let's work on that. Focus on their strengths. And especially since this is the time being, it might be a year, it might be months before they're back in school. Focus on what you're able to do, because you don't want them to fall too far behind just because you're trying to complicate things and trying to fit the instruction during the regular day schedule that they would have. It doesn't matter to kids whether they're learning at night or at the daytime or weekends instead of the weekdays. As long as they're learning, it's going to benefit them. And remember, homeschool kids oftentimes are much better students and learners because they get one-on-one instruction. You think of a school classroom, you got one teacher to 15, 20, 30, 40 students. There's not enough one-on-one time with the instructor. So the teacher oftentimes has to kind of do a big gauge of the classroom and a big gauge of their learning and try to target a few areas, but you can't really tailor the instruction to the one person. So if you're spending 30 minutes on a subject with your child, they're probably getting better instruction and better feedback than they would in a classroom. And for people who feel like, well, I don't have a degree, wasn't trained as an instructor. If you have the book, if you have the learning materials right in front of you, just review it before you sit with the kid. You just need to be a day or two smarter than your kid to be able to teach them. You don't have to know everything. And a lot of times those books are very good about showing you the lesson and how to do something. So take a minute, learn that, and then go teach it to them. You still are able to do it.
And that's well stated. I think one of the things that we could add there is that there needs to be a good relationship between the parents and the teachers. Because one of the things the teachers are able to bring to learning is that they know the learning goals, they know the program learning outcomes, they know the curriculum, and they know where the major direction is heading to. If everyone is supposed to head to the top of the mountain, the teachers have the map on how you're supposed to get there and what has been charted out as the map to get there. And so as a parent, to avoid going into different directions, if you have a good relationship with the teachers and they spell out for you these learning outcomes and learning goals and program learning outcomes and the rubrics, and you have a discussion on that, you can be on the same page, first of all, because that will make your work less demanding at home, because now you have targeted training for your child. You know exactly where you're targeting your efforts. Like Linda, you're saying, if you are looking for 2 quality hours, then you know where you're targeting that to. The other thing is investing in learning the app and learning the technology, because even the tech creators, the app creators, are not perfect, right? They are just trying to figure out what works best, but they don't understand every learner. But if you understand the app, and Mike, one of the things that we, at least in Africa, have a challenge with is that our parents, as you know, didn't go to school in an era of using technology. And then they didn't go, like Mike, you said it very well, they didn't go into school in an era of using apps. So this is really new to them. And so there's no historical learning of how to use these things. And so the way to cope with it is to disengage. and just say, I don't know how to use that thing. Someone else will teach you, or you figure it out. But what if a parent invests in saying, I will get someone to mentor me on how to use this app, to troubleshoot it, to figure out shortcuts for this app so that my kid can get the most out of it? I have the privilege of knowing at least fairly when an app is badly designed. And I have a privilege of knowing at least when to know what the distractions are in the app. Like Micah was saying, I know my kid loves playing with the mouth and pressing that button because it entertains him. But I know that that's a shortcoming in the app, that maybe it shouldn't be there. I've seen apps that give him the answer before he tries to figure it out, right? And I don't like that. Like, I don't want an app that gives him an answer before he figures it out. And so what he does, sometimes I have to put a paper on top of the answer so he doesn't see it before he says it. Otherwise, he will see the cup and he'll just say, cup. I'm like, how did you figure it out? There, the cup. I'm like, oh my God, the person who designed the app just put the cup there. The kid is not going to know the word. He's just going to look at the cup. He's so smart. And so I have to know that this app is not effective in that sense. It's not perfect. It's helping him, but it's not perfect. So I have to figure out ways to understand that this app can be maximized in this way. So one other thing I also did, Mike, when I was experimenting with this app in Kenya, that was actually from the ministry. And the good thing the ministry did, it gave you the learning outcomes, it gave you the rubrics. And so I decided, before I actually tell my 5-year-old to experiment with it, I'm going to master the learning outcome and the rubrics before he starts using it. So that by the time he starts using it, I have an idea when I'm watching him, even if it's those 2 hours, I know what I want him to get out of it from this app. So that anything distracting him, I can help him get away from it to focus on this learning outcome and the rubric. So if I know that, then I know what he should be getting from the app, right? So the app, like Linda said, it's a tool, but you can use the tool effectively if you know why it was designed, right? So there's a reason for designing the tool that the developer doesn't tell you necessarily clearly, but then you have the materials for figuring out what the purpose is for that particular tool and how to use it. It's like a manual. If you know the manual, then you know how to use the tool. And so some of those things can really make this transition and this challenge parents face and everyone faces useful, and make this learning in technology useful if more investment is put in just learning these things. I saw in the US recently a certain family that they're very busy. Both of them, they are professionals, they work, and they work long hours. This is a luxury, but if you can afford it. So what they did is hired another student to come at home and sit with their children when they're learning from the Zoom app during that period. So what this other person does is they take notes on what the teachers are saying in the Zoom app and what the teachers are asking the students to do and how the students is interacting with it, so that even if the parent is at work, when she comes home, she had this person to just give her notes when she comes at home, to know what happened, what the teacher said. So the parent is exhausted, doesn't have time to go play back Zoom. Of course, I wouldn't have time. I would be too exhausted to play back Zoom to figure out what happened. I want to figure out what they're going to eat, whether they will sleep. I have to rest. But if someone has done that, even if it's a relative or a friend or someone, then I know where to pick up from as a parent, because the child already has a natural connection with you, and you can help them to maximize what they learned. So there are many ways to deal with this challenging transition. It's just the effort and the resources and the thoughtfulness that is needed to maximize learning.
I'm sure there's some parents who are probably thinking, you know what, I'm just going to wait until we get back to in-person classes, and then I'm going to hand this child back over to the education system. So, do you think it's worth a parent investing in, because you guys are giving excellent advice, do you think it's worth a parent investing in really getting to understand how technology can be leveraged to help their child learn? Or do you think it's just one of those things, you know what, COVID is going to end at some point, even from the school's perspective, we don't even need to, quote unquote, work on retraining our teachers, because we're going to go back to the same thing we know very well.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying? So is it worth it to look at this as a way of thinking habits that they want to develop for the long term, as in terms of rethinking their role as a parent, or seeing how they can in their learning, or seeing how technology can be used to further education outcomes? Or do we just wait until this thing is on the other side, and we can go back to the balance of me being a parent in the house and you in the school dealing with all that learning stuff?
I think it's a very good question. I think globally there's a global tide that's moving towards leveraging technology. There's a global tide that's moving, whether we like it or not, towards learning through technology. And it presents a very difficult challenge, like you said, Mike, to parents to think about whether they want to be part of this transition or want to be left behind. Because what's going to happen is, question to parents is whether you want to be a victim of learning inequality or education inequality. Because while you make that decision, some people are already making the decision, we are moving forward and we are leveraging technology. And it doesn't mean it substitutes, like you're saying, taking the kids back and handing them back to the teachers. It means that at home, the kids come and use the technology. And I do that with my children. They still go to a traditional brick and mortar. I'm sure, Linda, you do it as well. And they come home and you find these learning apps. They can maximize their learning. For instance, just take one simple thing, background knowledge. What has been found is that background knowledge makes it possible to acquire more knowledge, in the sense that if you have background knowledge, you can acquire more knowledge. Remember the three things I said: storage, encoding knowledge, storing knowledge, retrieving knowledge. You could actually maximize that for your kid if you take advantage of technology, in the sense that, especially the storage part, because that is so crucial. You can't ask a kid to retrieve knowledge they don't have. And there's only so much that school can do for your child. We expect sometimes way too much from teachers. That there's a limit. But then technologies can actually help to fill that gap, in the sense that maybe you're deepening the background knowledge of your child. Maybe if a good app can force the child to retrieve knowledge often, maybe a good app that teaches a kid how to learn, like Linda, you said, that teaches how to learn so they can learn, because a kid who knows how to learn will go far regardless, because they can learn almost anything, and technology can help with that if it's used effectively. So I don't think it's wise to think of it as a momentary shift, but more or less to think about, even for Africa, how do we compete? Even in Kenya, how do you compete in Kenya in terms of, from a knowledge sort of standpoint? How do we compete? If we have to compete, we don't have a choice. We have to learn. We have to have a population that can learn. We have to have a population that can acquire this knowledge. We have a population that can go online. A lot of knowledge already exists online. In fact, that's why some colleges are moving from lecturing and saying, why do we keep lecturing things that are already online, right? So there's already a lot of knowledge for kids who are willing to move ahead and willing to keep going ahead. And we will be at a disadvantage as a continent or as countries in Africa if we think that this is momentary, because for some countries, this is it. We are moving on. Technology is the thing. We're going to keep moving, and we're going to make the best we can from technology. So at different level, at a parental level, the issue is you don't want your child to be a victim of education inequality. Of course, that's a structural problem. At a country level, you need a population that learns and can make advantage of technology. At a continental level, we need a continent where people actually have deeper knowledge on many things that can make us able to move the continent further ahead, beyond other continents, because people are doing it. We don't have a choice. It's just there. The other day, I wanted to learn about the Large Hadron Collider. I went to YouTube. I created 10 YouTube videos on Large Hadron Collider. I don't know a lot about it, but I can explain to you what it does and why it's important that you should know about the Large Hadron Collider, right? I've never taken a class in physics, in quantum physics, but here I am. I can mention even that difficult word, Large Hadron Collider, because I chose to use the online platform to learn about what this thing is.
I agree. I think Africa and educational institutions in Africa need to start looking at ways to introduce this. And like you said, even at a simple level, parents need to figure out how to introduce technology to their children earlier, even if it's just an app on your phone, using that one phone that's in the family. You don't have to find thousands of dollars to go get a computer, all that. But sometimes if your phone is a smartphone, download an app, let your children start using it when they get home from school, just introduce it slowly, because one of the biggest things that we're seeing, like you said, there's going to be a wave of change moving forward. And I think once we've all tapped into some technology tools for education, we're not going to go back as much as we think we are. And I think it's important that the continent looks at opportunities to introduce more and more technology moving forward. And it can be a good thing. If more universities go online, then that means a lot of people in Africa can apply for those programs, do those programs from where they are without needing to come to anywhere. They can gain the experience that they need to. The universities in Africa need to look at creating online opportunities for growing, to grow their own programs and to educate more people on the continent. Africa is looking like it's going to have the largest population of young people in the next few decades. So we are going to be where employers look to grow their companies and to hire people. And so it's important for us to take the time to build the programs that are going to be able to build that workforce in the next 10 to 15 years. And so, we got to be prepared to be able to handle that, because all these jobs, everybody uses a computer, whether you like it or not, and so having some access or some skill level with the computer and technology will go a long way in making sure that our young people on the continent are the most employed worldwide.
Mm-hmm. More or less building a 21st century workforce.
Yes.
It's going to take those challenges. I think, Mike, it's a good question in terms of, and I wonder what you think in terms of what we do as a country. I think it's also the issue of political will, and the investment it's part of it, but that's the political will. I like your point, Linda, on universities making the shift, but it will also require a lot of willingness to make that shift. Yes. You and I have seen cases where shifting from lecturing to using online platforms it's made so political that nothing happens. It becomes so difficult. Anyway, Mike, back to you.
No, I mean, you've said it all. For me, the only extra piece that I put in there is the opportunities for private-public partnerships to scale some of these solutions. You need the policy environment for that, but you also need the innovation from the private sector as well to start building, and because there's opportunity there. There's definitely opportunity there to gain something. And then obviously there'll be those social benefits because, like you said, we have no choice. I was on a webinar yesterday, and this guy was making the comparison that if you think about all the challenges in terms of learning that have been faced on the continent, and you compare that to some other areas where the challenges have not been as deep. If you think about a race, then those children are already ahead than our children back home. So then you're already playing from the backfield for people who are already running ahead of you. They're already running ahead of you before COVID, and now they're even further along. We don't. It's clear that whether, God forbid, another COVID situation would happen, we don't have a choice in terms of an overhaul of the way we look at education and how it's provided. And then I think, given the scale of the solutions, you definitely, governments are just too stretched thin to be the full solution providers. So you're going to need some public-private partnerships there to help scale those solutions. Even for universities, universities might not have the means or the expertise to develop some of these How many, Linda needs to help help some of these professors rethink the way they're going to be
Enough trouble
presenting.
here.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, you're having trouble here. So, imagine some of the difficulties that could be faced back home, but I think we have to do it. We have to do it.
Well, thank you so much for this very meaningful discussion, Linda and Mike. And thank you all for joining and listening into this very important conversation, a very important time of transitioning from previous education systems to new one. We're talking about moving towards an education system building on Mike's point, one that is adaptive and resilient, that can face crises. And we're also talking about, as Linda pointed out, training a 21st century workforce, because this is going to happen and technology is facilitating this shift. There are many points that have been made here about training, but training not just for parents or just a student, but training for teachers, parents, students, and building relationships that move this process forward. I like Mike's point about policy gaps. It's an issue of looking at the current policies on education and really grappling whether these are policies for the 21st century education system and what can be done to advance these policies towards a new system, because this will have to be standards that are created also in policies. But I think that we've also pointed out that there has to be willingness from a domestic level to a university level to a political level to a university level to make this change happen. And so we're also making the case that this willingness has to be cross-cutting at different levels. It won't be enough for parents to make the shift, teachers, but it has to be also at leaders, universities. There will be sacrifices that have to be made, but for the long-term benefit. So we will come back to this conversation. We hope that at least these thoughts will get you thinking about what education means today with the advent of technology, what learning means today, and what kind of Africa we want in the 21st century and how we get there. There are so many opportunities out there to advance the continent, so many. It's just an issue of how we learn how to maximize what technology is providing us today. And Linda said it's a tool, but we also have to think about the human aspect in terms of how do we create healthy combination between the human aspect and the tool that we call technology to advance the continent to a new era. If we don't, others will do, and we'll still stay behind, but we are hopeful and optimistic that the continent has the workforce, the resources, the technologies, and the abilities to move forward. Again, thank you, and we will see you, or we will be with you in the next podcast.
Join us for the next episode of All Things Africa with Levy, Mike, and Linda. To get instant notifications on new episodes, subscribe to our podcast wherever you listen to our podcast, or find us on Anchor at anchor.fm/allthingsafrica. Follow us on Twitter and keep the conversation going with the hashtag AllThingsAfrica.